the Zoom space really quick. And we'll get started in just a few seconds. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're about to get started, just letting a few more people come in to the room. Alrighty, we'll get started and more people will come as they do. Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Director of Events at Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome you all to today's PNP Live discussion. A couple of housekeeping items to go over before we begin. First, I will be dropping a link in the chat where you can purchase a copy of today's book straight from PNP's website. And we offer shipping to anywhere in the US. But if you live in the DC area, you can actually pick up your copy from any of our 3 store locations around the district. Also, if you'd like to ask a question, you can put that in the Q&A space at the bottom of your screen. Please submit any questions you like throughout the event. We'll get to those in the later part of the event. And we ask that you put them in the Q&A section instead of the chat, just so we can kind of keep them all straight. Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. First, Véronique Tadjo is a poet, novelist, academic, and artist who was born in Paris and brought up in the Ivory Coast. Her most recent book, In the Company of Men, draws on real accounts of the Ebola outbreak that devastated West Africa and explores critical questions about how we cope with a global crisis and how we can combat fear and prejudice. Moderating the conversation is Sarah Davies Cordova, former resident director of Marquette University's South Africa Service Learning Program, centered at the Desmond Tutu Peace Center in Cape Town and the University of the Western Cape. She previously worked on a series of interviews with Véronique Tadjo and later organized a conference that examined the breadth of her body of work. So please help me welcome them both to your screens. Hi.
Thank you, Brittany, for your warm introduction, and thank you to Politics and Prose for hosting this conversation. Bonjour, Véronique. Hi, Véronique.
Bonjour, Sarah. And thank you to Politics and Prose as well. Thank you for hosting us.
So in addition to Véronique being the award-winning poet and novelist, and she's also a painter, and she's also an editorialist and often produces op-ed pieces for the press. So she's very engaged in everything that is going on around the world, as indeed this novel itself indicates for the Ebola crisis that happened between 2014 and 2016 in West Africa, in particular in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And perhaps In the Company of Men epitomizes most poignantly the complexity of Véronique Tadjo's ethical sensibility. It's a poetics or a poethics of the care and attention that must be paid to the world's interconnectedness, to the plants, to the trees, to the animals, to the insects, and the human beings in all their diversity and in all their fragile precarity. So indeed, In the Company of Men brings into sharp focus the humanitarian disaster of the Ebola crisis that was first declared in 2014. So I'd like to start, Véronique, by asking you, how did you come to think about writing a novel about that crisis, the Ebola crisis? And where were you at the time when this struck and started entering your thinking and your wondering about how best to address it? And of course, Ivory Coast is right next to Liberia and Guinea and Sierra Leone. And so obviously it hit home fairly close.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. In fact, it didn't come as a conscious decision. It was circumstances that made me write the book in the end. But I was, as usual, between different countries, in the sense that I was living in South Africa when the Ebola outbreak erupted. I was at the University of the Witwatersrand teaching at the French and Francophone department. And I had been there for already more than 10 years. But one thing is that I was constantly visiting Côte d'Ivoire, because I go twice, sometimes 3 times on a good year, 3 times to Abidjan, or minimum two times. And I was really worried when I went to Abidjan, because although the epidemic was taking place in Guinea first, then Liberia, and then Sierra Leone, it was expected that the disease would spread to Côte d'Ivoire, because as you've just said, Côte d'Ivoire has the same border with Guinea in the north and Liberia in the west. Therefore, it was really, the whole country was under a lot of strain. And I was worried about my family and friends. So I started following the story very closely, and especially because I was abroad, maybe. You know how it happens when you live abroad and you think about family and friends. You have a tendency to anguish quite a lot. And so I was constantly, scanning the news, wanting to know more and more. And luckily, in South Africa and in the university where I was, there were conferences, and everybody was also worried about what was happening in West Africa, and medics and a lot of medical equipment was shifted to Sierra Leone and Liberia. So I was very aware of what was happening. It was constantly in the news. And also, I don't know if you remember, but the Ebola epidemic was covered intensely in terms of the media. It was very, very focused. It was all over, the news, and it was a time of high tension. So this lasted for quite a while, and it had different stages. At some stage, everybody thought that it was going to be staying in West Africa, in those 3 countries. And then it started spreading. That means people who traveled started bringing 1 or 2 cases in the West. And also the medics, the medical personnel who had worked in the affected countries had to be repatriated when they were sick. So it started to look like it could spread. So there was a big change, and a huge amount of, let's say, solidarity and fight. Everybody then went into the fight to contain the disease, and it was contained in 2016. And then it seemed that there was silence. There was a blanket of silence over the whole subject. And that puzzled me a lot. I was wondering, well, what is going on? What has happened was so big. How come we're not talking about it? We're not processing it? And that troubled me a lot. And I understood that the stigma that had been attached to the continent made it really hard to talk about it. I think we know now that in periods of great trauma, it's very difficult then for those who have survived to talk about it, or because it's too painful. And I think that it was very, very, very painful for the continent. So I started thinking that that silence needed to be broken, and then we should continue the conversation. And how could we continue the conversation away from the headlines and away from, yes, a period of intense scrutiny? How could we reclaim the story and look at ourselves in a different way? Telling, in a sense, telling our own side of the story, if you want.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and it had disappeared completely from the news, so there was no more visibility in the West as soon as the fear of it being able to come to the West had subsided. So it becomes very important to stop hearing it from the perspective of Western news or Northern hemispheric news, and begin to retell it really, and hold it, possess it in one's own terms, rather than in the way it can be either wiped out of sound and not being heard about, or not really spoken about. I mean, I think there probably was more going on, but it certainly wasn't in the news anymore. And so the novel was, when it came out in 2017, sort of really brought it to the fore, at least in the Francophone world. And so it's a necessary, I think, translation that you have brought about, so that it can spread to the Anglophone parts of the world, and allow the African story from the African side to come through in English as well as it has in French. One of the things that's very sort of prevalent, or very visible in the novel, is how much scientific information you actually sort of slip into the chapters, when one sort of skips over it in a way when one first reads it, because it's so well woven in, as you're so good at doing. But there's an awful lot of that research that you must have done in order to be able to put it in literary terms, and yet have it throughout the novel. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you do that blending and bringing together of a literary approach to so much scientific material?
Yes, it was quite a difficult balance, because on one hand I wanted the readers to get some information, or at least I wanted to share the information that I gathered from my research, and that was available. And because I thought it was important to give some exact information. And so that bit is, when there is an information, it's a real information, if you want. It's not in the domain of the imagination. But at the same time, I didn't want the readers to be stuck in some sort of scientific report, or because first I can't do it. I'm not a scientist, and second, it wasn't the motivation. The motivation was to give information, but at the same time throw a different light. That means, as I maybe said earlier, go away from just the headlines and the scientific treaties, so that maybe the readers could identify with what was happening and could understand that I was trying to open it up to a different conversation, more of a conversation between ourselves, in the sense that when I say between ourselves, I mean between ourselves, ordinary citizens. Because there is a kind of hierarchy that says that, okay, you are not in control of your own health. You become an object, and you are being told everything about your health. So it was, in a way, an attempt at controlling that space that we lose, and saying that, can we look at it just as ordinary people? What can we take? What can we take from it, so that we don't feel so powerless when these things happen? So I think that's what I wanted to do.
Maybe what we need to do is just talk about how the novel is structured for those that haven't yet read the book and been hold of it. So it's divided into 17 chapters and into parts with those chapters arranged, and almost each chapter is a different character, and they are all, as you were saying, ordinary everyday people for the most part, except for maybe the researcher who comes in. But again, it's his perspective on his research and what he's been able to find out about the virus, Ebola. But maybe you want to talk about how you chose those characters to construct the different points of view that you give throughout the novel to bring a village together, or bring a community together.
The thing is that when I was doing my research, and the more I was digging into the subject, I realized that even the scientists themselves came to the conclusion that science alone would not solve the matter. That means they wouldn't be able to do it just by saying, here are the scientific elements and everybody follows the science. It was much more complicated because of the human dimension of people either resisting, or people wanting to do things differently, or people thinking that they were being ordered to do things against their will. So there were lots of, in fact, communication was an important factor. And it was only when medical experts finally got the collaboration of people that the epidemic was more easily contained. That means it was absolutely essential to have the collaboration of the people. Nothing could be done just with science. You can't force people to accept science if they're not convinced. And that was I thought that was something absolutely extraordinary to learn from the epidemic. And that's why maybe I decided that I would give as many voices as possible, because you needed that conversation, that to and fro, that listening ability in order to make people work together. So that's why you have ordinary people who are next to extraordinary people, but the ordinary people are doing extraordinary things. Like you take this young man who decides, this young man who is a student, who, the university is closed, and he decides that he's going to volunteer to dig graves, to help dig graves. I mean, just imagine the courage that this represents, because it was very dangerous, not only scary, but also dangerous. So here you have a young man who says himself that he considers himself as an ordinary young man, but then he surprises himself. So I think that in time of crisis, some people rise and others maybe show that their weaknesses. But one thing is for sure is that you need everybody and the cooperation of everybody working together to defeat something as huge as an epidemic. And today we see it at a global level. That means countries very far apart, in a way, have to work together. I mean, you can't hoard all the vaccine in one place and then leave the rest of the planet without vaccine. It's not going to work. So we see that even at when you look at an epidemic, which is a much smaller scope, you can learn so much from something that's much bigger.
And even just amongst people, I mean, certainly in all of the sort of Western world, there's been this sort of with COVID-19, there's been those that have been willing to help one another by wearing the masks, by making all the social distancing possible, and trying to the best of their abilities to follow these directives, and those that won't, right? And so something falls apart as soon as there isn't everyone working towards the same goal to arrest it, or at least prevent it from spreading to the same extent as we know this one has, in large part because, again, people weren't willing to remain in place and prevent the spread to the extent that it has.
Yeah. But I think that maybe that's when the issue of trust comes in. You know, in an epidemic, I think it's a highly political period, because it's a kind of challenge, a constant challenge to see if the government is going to be able to manage this huge crisis. So there's a question of trust also, the question of do people trust in their government? Do they think that they are in safe hands, that everything will be done to bring them back to you know, a normal life? So I think this is also a big issue that we can learn, is that it starts with a health crisis and then it evolves to a much bigger scenario, a much bigger, you know, with a big political dimension.
Transparency, always this issue of transparency. What is behind the politics that are being played out? Are they really for the good of the Republic, the chose publique, that res publica, or is it for political gain, or is it for political maneuvering? We just saw with the agreement to distribute vaccines in Southeast Asia, I think it is, with this arrangement, but it is also to stop the Chinese and the Russians from having a sphere of influence in that region. So it's very worrying, I think, as individual human beings, seeing that the health of the human beings that are at stake are being played for political gain or political power.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is what is fascinating. It's all the kind of directions you can go, and I know there's going to be probably more. There are already, and there will be more narratives coming from different approaches, And that's how, in the end, we will be able to understand better what we can learn from the different situations. And a lot of people do that, go back to the previous epidemics and look at what lessons can be drawn.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and that's how I suppose we must evolve this. That's why we can't just have a kind of hide away and put a blanket on past events, even if they are difficult. I think that's what memory does. Memory helps us to process information and to give us the ability to be better prepared for the future.
Yeah, we hope. We hope.
But I'm fascinated by one thing is when I look at what is happening today with the pandemic, and I see how people really want to document everything. It's everything has to be documented, from the drawing that a child made while being bored in confinement, to a statue, to a painting, to some music, to big decisions, to health restrictions, to there's even a museum already built.
Right.
Museums with an S in different parts of the world, built just to document what has happened to us, what is happening, and how it will teach us how to behave in the future. Because that's what we have to do as human beings. We have to remember what we've gone through, so that maybe the
next time we can use the good things that we've managed to learn and try and avoid repeating the mistakes that we have made.
Exactly. That's what.
Which is a little bit what your baobab in the novel does.
Yes,
right. He's sort of that memory, right? He's the one who comes from from the forest and the history of the land and the history of the environment of the deep forest, and he's a listener, right?
Yes.
I mean, he's called a whispering tree, or it's a baobab, and in English it becomes a whispering tree, whereas in French it would be an arbre à parole. But it's almost as much that he listens as that he speaks.
Oh yes, he listens more than he speaks. He just ties up the different voices. He's the line that goes through the different voices, but he's listening. He's trying to listen to everybody, give everybody a chance to say what they have to say, and then listen. And the other characters are supposed to listen to those who are coming after them. It's a bit like in a village surrounding, when you have a storyteller, or even in a storytelling session, is that whoever is given the opportunity to speak must then, after speaking, must sit down and then listen to others, and then sit down and listen to others. And there is, in most storytelling, there is this calling on the audience to kind of respond, and then there is an interaction. It's not just kind of linear story. There is interaction. There are things happening on the side. It's very interactive.
almost all the characters speak in the first person in the novel. There's a few chapters where it's a third person narrative, especially in the beginning. But the tree speaks, and you also have a bat that speaks, and you even have Ebola, the virus, speaking. How did you bring these voices in? How did you anthropomorphize or personify these elements that don't usually speak in a novel? I mean, we often have them obviously in stories, in children's stories, and in some of the contes, traditional contes. But how do you bring them into this setting?
Well, it's just the folktale tradition. And the folktale tradition exists everywhere. I mean, we call it African oral traditions, but you find them in India, you find them in America among the Indians, you find them everywhere. You find them everywhere. In Europe, there is this oral tradition, which is the carrier of all the legends and myths and proverbs and songs. All that is part of oral tradition, and it has existed for a long time, and it will exist for a long time, because this is the most direct route to your ear, you know. And also the beauty of orality is that when you talk for several people, not just for one person, but you are as a group listening to something, and you can react individually and collectively. So it's an ancient form, and I think that it's a universal form of telling our stories. So it has a lot of advantages and a lot of similarities, connections between cultures. That's what I find amazing. I like to cite La Fontaine, Jean La Fontaine, who was a 17th century French poet who wrote fables, very, very well-known fables. And I mean, I learned them at school, and millions of people know them because they have some morality. But animals talk. You know, everybody talks. You know, the horse, the wolf, everybody talks, and that's what I find amazing. So it's not, in a sense, it's not a new thing.
No, but it's having them in a novel. Mixed with very, very human individual characters that we can recognize very easily. I mean, you've got the nurse, you've got the doctor, you've got the lovers, you've got the mother, you've got the children, and woven in, you've got the baobab in particular, but also the bat and the and the virus Ebola coming forward,
absolutely.
which I mean,
the idea,
usually they're sort of separate genres, right? And so again, with the way that you always write, where you're mixing different genres and different voices and different degrees of poetry or more narrative texts. Here you've got these voices that you haven't had in the same way in your text before. So I think that's, you know, where I was interrogating the fact that you brought them in.
Yes, it's just because I was trying to put the story within an environmental context, where you're looking at nature, you're looking at humans and non-humans, and you're trying to see how they can work together, how we can have this respect for nature, and how we can find a new balance so that we live in a more harmonious world, in a sense. So there's this search to recognize non-humans as part of the story. Because you take the bat that is a healthy carrier of the Ebola virus, normally lives in the forest and as a wild animal stays in the forest. But with the deforestation, which is not just due to the governments, the local governments, but it's also due to forces from outside. I mean, it is known that if you want, everybody loves chocolate, but to have chocolate and to enjoy your chocolate, you need plantations, cocoa plantations, and cocoa plantations have a very destructive impact on the environment. So there are all these forces at play. So who you have to call. It's almost like you have to call everybody to try and understand how complex the story is. It's not just one side. It's a lot of. Is it the bat's fault that the virus gets to human beings who have destroyed the habitat and forced the wild animals to come closer to the settlements, to the habitations, no. So we have to kind of find a pact of cohabitation with the non-humans. I mean, with the people and what surrounds us. It seems so obvious. So it's a way by having the voice of the bat and the virus itself. It's a way of saying, in fact, we are sharing the same space, and we need to find an understanding, an agreement of a pact of non-aggression, a pact of, in a sense, mutual respect.
We're seeing it in all sorts of different ways, both with the animals, as you say, coming in closer to, well, I don't know if they're coming in closer or we're getting closer to them by destroying their habitats, right, and encroaching on where they've always been. But nevertheless, we're in much closer contact with one another, and of course, it's also affecting the climate, and the climate itself is also destroying the nature. So it's sort of as you say, something that is circulating and affecting everything, is affecting everybody and everything.
Oui.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I see there's a few questions there. So maybe just as a link, as I look into the questions, or maybe Brittany can help us. I just wanted to ask about the title, En compagnie des hommes, or in the company of men. Obviously, there's who's in the company, and also, did you struggle with that title?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yeah, you see, in the company of human beings, just didn't sound right. Even in French, en compagnie des êtres humains, it wasn't. Because I wanted to talk about a company. A company means people together from different kinds. And in fact, en compagnie des hommes is the non-humans who are saying we are in the company of humans, and we're watching what they're doing, and we have something to say. It's that sort of thing. It's that sort of everybody is together and talking and having this conversation, and so it's the animals who are in the company of man.
Yeah. When I first read the title, I wasn't sure.
Man with a capital, man with a capital
letter.
Of course, M, and capital H with But you can see you can see that we still have a lot to do with language. We still have a lot of work.
It's complicated. It's very complicated finding that, because I mean, as you're pointing out, the problem is men, right? Because it's women and men. It's the human family, and humanity sounds weird too.
Yeah, you couldn't say in the company of humanity, or you couldn't say it. I'm afraid it had to be man.
Brittany, do you want to see if there's any questions that we can?
Yeah, you guys actually addressed some of the questions, so that was great. We have a lot of questions about COVID, understandably, because the book is about an epidemic. So let's see. So first, Timothy says, "Hello, my name is Tim. I'm a PhD student at Florida State University. Something that was going through my mind while I was reading is how much does it predict or foreshadow the COVID-19 pandemic? At many points, you write something to the effect of, quote, 'This is not the last epidemic, there will be more.' I'm wondering how it feels to reread this novel 4 years after its publication, but in the light of the worldwide pandemic."
That's why I wanted to put it back in the context of an environmental crisis, because the more I research the subject, and people who are interested in the subject know that, the type of imbalance we have created in nature and in our environment and in our relationship with animals make it much more possible that there will be epidemics. And all you have to do is look at what happened just before Ebola, the different epidemics that came before. You had swine flu, bird flu, MERS, SARS. So you could see, if you were interested in the topic, that this was not going to be a one-off, but that it could happen again if things did not change in a very dramatic way. So that's the lesson that we can see. That's why people are anxiously asking for some form of change today, so that we never again get to a stage like this one we're going through. So something has to happen in one way or another, so that we have a much healthier relationship with animals, relationship with nature, relationship between ourselves as well, in terms of inequalities and in terms of access to, for example, water, global warming. I mean, there's quite a lot. So, in fact, it's not to say to scare everybody off or anything like that. It's just to say, maybe let's open our eyes and let's see what's happening around us and where we can bring some change so that we have something a bit more balanced. I think that's it. I often talk about industrial farming. I mean, when you think that in the Western world, the way people love animals, I mean, there are so many pets, you know, cats, dogs, sometimes even birds, but not too much now. And so much so that it has become an industry also. I mean, it's quite commercial. and very expensive to have a pet if you want to follow the guidelines. But what I'm trying to say is that at the same time, you have industrial farming, which is the utmost cruelty to animals. So there's something that's not quite right to have thousands and thousands of chickens cooked together and in terrible conditions, or to have pigs that have just a few squares to live their lives for I don't know how long. Of course, these are extremes, but if you look at the way we consume, at the way we live our life, and we always want more, then you can see that you wonder how are we going to be able to stop this. There was a time not so long ago, I think 30 years, 40 years, or at least maybe our parents, they didn't eat as much meat as we do today. Luckily, there's a whole movement, to cut down on meat, but there was a time when meat was like some kind of a luxury. You didn't have to have chicken every day or a steak every day or so. So I guess there are things we can do that won't cost us that much, but that can make a big difference, maybe.
Absolutely. Here's another question. This person says, it appears that women leaders dealt with COVID-19 more effectively than their male counterparts. Could you comment on that pattern? Did a similar pattern emerge during the Ebola crisis in West Africa?
Yes, women were very important in the Ebola crisis. And there's one reason for that is women tend to be the carers. That means they will care for the young ones, and they will also care for the older members of the family. So they have a tendency to stay around longer, so that in the case of the Ebola epidemic, in fact, a lot of women were affected by it, and there were quite a lot of victims. But at the same time, when the idea was to contain the disease, and the medical experts realized that, as I said earlier, only science will not do it. Women became much more involved. That means it was very important to give information to those women, to empower them, so that they could pass on the information and know what to do and help the community. So they're very, very important actors in the fight. And I guess that at a leadership level, they might bring that idea of the family a bit more. Maybe they're better listeners. I wouldn't say I don't want to idealize anybody, but it's possible that they were maybe listening more to the communities and what could be done together.
Another question kind of related to COVID. You said earlier in the event that you can't force people to believe in science if they don't. Why do you think those people deny scientific facts and evidence? For example, a staggering number of people around the world still say they will not get the COVID vaccine, even though it has proven to work.
Well, in fact, you'd be surprised, because when you had the people denying that Ebola existed, and those people lived in a village, it was easy to say, oh, look at them, they're ignorant, they probably haven't been educated, they don't know any better, blah, blah, blah. And you come to the West, some of the richest countries, people have had education, they've got TV, they've got newspapers, they've got everything at their disposal. Scientists talk to them and they still deny it. So there you have the question of trust, is that they don't trust the people who are telling them what they know, who are relaying the information. And that is an important factor. If you don't trust the person who is talking to you, then even if that person says something sensible, unfortunately, you won't listen because you don't trust that person. So behind it, there's a whole story. Like, for example, if you take the vaccines, if you go through colonization, in some parts of Africa, there have been lots of experiments on people to see if some of the vaccines will work, or some medical mistakes, and also the fact that it happened during colonization created a certain tension. And so people stayed with that feeling that maybe one of their grandfather died during colonization because of a campaign that went wrong. There were some good campaigns that did eradicate some diseases, but behind, if you have a situation of oppression and mistrust, then you have a tendency not to want to have anything to do with whoever is talking to you. So if you're living in a very unequal situation, for example, you might refuse to go ahead because you think nobody has ever cared about you anyway. So why should they do it now?
Another question from Karen. She says, I loved the presence of poems and songs in the novel. Do they hold a particular importance to you in the context of the book?
Yes, I think that there are also different voices in their own right. For example, when you read a poem and then there's the name of the poet, then it's the voice of the poet. So in a sense, it's an added voice. Or if you have a song, then it's the voice of the singer. And that's sometimes I feel that that's how we live. We listen to music, we listen to poetry, we read books, we read newspapers. We do so many things. We go to the cinema. We do so many things at the same time that they are still in our heads. Lots of things are in our heads at the same time. So these are voices also, voices. And you know how when you're in love, you look for a poem that's beautiful that you're going to share. Or when you're in distress, you can also look for poetry to find some solace, or a song might make you feel much better. So these are elements that also impact on us.
Reflect on the period that we're going through very often.
Exactly. You can just listen to a song and say, wow, and go back to the period when you used to listen to that song. It's quite amazing.
Cassian says, you were one of a group of African writers who traveled to Rwanda together and then wrote about the genocide in your works. Is there any way that your experience in Rwanda informed your writing of In the Company of Men?
Yes, definitely. In the sense, it's in the sense that I kind of learned what human beings are capable of doing. That means the kind of hurt they can inflict on each other or on one another. And we've seen that in history. It's not just Rwanda, but of course with the Holocaust, that you could say there is Nagasaki and Hiroshima. You could say there's wars, the war in Syria at the moment. You can see that in a way yes, once you understand that, then you understand that people can really also be hard and cruel to one another. So it's just a question of knowing it and knowing that we do have to work on it, and it's in our human nature to go to war, and therefore we need to really, when we have such a big challenge awaiting us, which is in a sense the survival of the planet, of ourselves, then we really need to know that what we're capable of, so that we can work at excluding that part of our nature.
Very often your work is almost like a bouclier, like a shield, that is sort of
I think
giving us a guard to feel safe behind, and to then be able to try to understand what you're reflecting on in your work, what you're writing about in your work. So I always think of it as a bouclier that I can use to give me the strength at some level to read what you then end up bringing out about what humanity is unfortunately capable of, and also what great things it is, as it becomes a shield of strength too.
Exactly. I think that's it. That's you can see the best and the worst. So how do we find ourselves in a situation where we can bring the better side of us? Well, yes, I think it's our struggle on Earth. I think we know that we always have that tendency. So we always have to work on how we can do what will bring the best out of us, which is not easy, but I think it's what I was going to say we're here on Earth to do, is to try and bring that side up to the forefront, and do it together.
Well, we are out of time, but thank you both so much for being here. If you all want to buy a copy of In the Company of Men, I've dropped the link in the chat a couple of times. You can get it straight from Politics and Prose's website. Please do that. It is so timely considering the things we're going through right now. Sarah, Véronique, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us today.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you, Véronique.
Thank you, Sarah.
It's lovely.